Good afternoon. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on September 11th, 2024. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Sharmine Narwani. Sharmine is an editor and columnist at the Cradle Media, and she's a longtime journalist who has published widely in both mainstream and independent media. She's noted for her extensive coverage on the Syrian war from inside Syria, and she's based from Beirut to London. Sharmine, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm so happy to finally meet up with you, Dimitri. Sorry I missed you on your trip to Beirut.
I'm sure there'll be other opportunities. I look forward to meeting you there, and I appreciate you've been very busy recently. So I'm happy to have you, even if only for 30 minutes. Sharmine, as you yourself have been commenting extensively, the right to dissent and the right to free expression is under, I would say, in my lifetime, an unprecedented assault in the West. And I'd like to mention a few cases, very recent ones, before we turn to the subject of the Cradle. First, in early August, the FBI and New York State Police conducted a raid at the home of Scott Ritter, a former UN weapons inspector and current critic of U.S. foreign policy. The raid was conducted pursuant to a warrant under the U.S. Foreign Agents Registration Act. It appears there's some suspicion, unproven, of course, that Mr. Ritter is acting as an agent of the Russian government. Then on August 16th, Richard Medhurst, an independent journalist who's been very critical of the West's support for Israel, was arrested at Heathrow Airport under Section 12 of the UK Terrorism Act 2000. That provision prohibits expressions of support for terrorist organizations. And Mr. Medhurst, as I understand it, to this very moment, is unsure exactly what the allegations are and how he is potentially viewed as having violated that draconian piece of legislation. Then on August 25th, Pavel Durov, the founder of Telegram, which has about 1 billion users, was detained in France amid an investigation into crimes related to alleged crimes, of course, related to child sexual abuse images, drug trafficking, and fraudulent transactions associated with the Telegram app. At the time of his arrest, Samidoun, a Palestinian human rights organization, expressed its view that this was likely motivated by a desire to pressure Mr. Durov to shut down pro-Palestinian and resistance accounts on Telegram. And then there's the case of Sarah Wilkinson on August 29th. So all of this has happened within the last 6 weeks or so. She's a British Palestinian solidarity activist. She was taken from her home after a morning raid by Britain's counter-terrorism police. And according to her son, Jack, they said she was under arrest for, quote, content that she has posted online. And her house was raided and police seized all her electronic devices. She was later released, but she's banned from using electronic devices. And since then, it has emerged that British police asked her to reveal the location of her contacts in Gaza. And this brings us to the case of the Cradle. The Cradle, a media organization of which you are an editor, was recently banned permanently by Meta. For the time being, as I understand it, Sharmine, the Cradle remains on X, where it has about 128,000 followers. Importantly, Meta owns a number of social media platforms, including Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. And the case of the Cradle, in my view, as a lawyer, highlights how the US government's failure to enforce American anti-monopoly laws exacerbates threats to the right to dissent. Because Meta has so many platforms, it's been allowed to accumulate so many platforms, a decision at the company-wide level to ban a media outlet like the Cradle can have severe impacts on the reach of that media outlet. Now, let's launch into it, Sharmine, by, if you could take a moment explaining what was the pretext given by Meta for the permanent ban.
There was no real pretext. We have, on occasion, had posts flagged and learned very early on when we launched in 2021 what to post, what not to post. And then the war on Gaza happened, and it was impossible not to cover the story. It just simply, I mean, it is the story, the main story, international story in all outlets. And so obviously, there were almost daily posts regarding not just the war in Gaza, but the escalation of the war into a regional one on various fronts. So in early August, we had a notice that, you could be permanently suspended if you post bad stuff. Anytime we had any notice, and there were so few and far between, Dimitri, I can't tell you, we immediately, either deleted the post or, learned something from it. Now, Meta's community guidelines are super vague, okay? And they become even more confusing when you look at what they're flagging for you and then compare them to what other media outlets are posting. There's got to be one standard for all or none at all. And then just a few days later, on August 16th, they told us we had a permanent ban without any explanation. The only sort of hints leading up to that was we noticed a lot of activity from them after the assassination of Hamas Politburo chief Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. Almost immediately after that, within 2 days, Instagram took down 10, I think it was 10 Cradle posts in 2 tranches of 5. And we were quite astounded. This was very new. We assumed that the political climate had heightened after Haniyeh's death or assassination, and the escalation by parties, the promise of retaliation by various parties in West Asia. But I think it's more than that. I mean, there are some Israeli cutouts that are now claimed by Meta as trusted partners who are, former Israeli officials linked to Israel in some way, even intelligence, with intelligence backgrounds. One in particular that was identified by tech reporter Jack Polson and former Intercept investigative journalist Li Fang, that we believe are instrumental in setting conditions for these large social media platforms. I know that just recently they failed to get Meta to adopt a ban on, I think it was, can't remember what the term was. It was either Zionism or from the river to the sea, but they're trying to limit the language we can use even to discuss these issues. Now, we're not alternative media. We're not podcasters. Nothing negative about those, people who do those things, because they're essential in expanding our understanding of many things that are happening in the world right now. There are only so many mainstream media outlets. They can't cover everything, and they don't often cover contentious issues well. So of course there is a huge amount of alternative media, podcasts, et cetera, that have emerged in the last years in order to, provide more information to people who are seeking it. They wouldn't be successful if people were not actively looking for information that made sense, for real facts. The Cradle is a journalist-driven media outlet based in West Asia, which means we cover this region reflective of the many different views here, some that are pro-US, some that are not, okay? Some that are pro the current global order and some that are against it. For us, the fact that the US and EU states, et cetera, prescribe groups like Hamas, the Palestinian resistance, and Hezbollah, the Lebanese resistance, even Ansarallah, the Yemeni resistance, as terrorist organizations, has no bearing on how we're going to report things. I mean, you can't have a one-size-fits-all kind of censorship in this world that is so different in all its corners, And these groups that are designated as terrorist groups by Western countries are not designated as such in most of the region. They are groups that emerged in a grassroots way or in response to aggressions. Okay. So they're not military in their entirety by any stretch of the imagination. Both Hamas and Hezbollah and Ansarullah are responsible for paying a lot of civilian salaries. They have set up hospitals, they have set up schools and universities and social services. We have, I mean, obviously Hamas won the Palestinian elections, the only ones held in 2006, resoundingly in the West Bank, in Christian cities, or, predominantly Christian cities of Ramallah, for instance. All 6 seats went to Hamas. There's a reason for this. These are political actors that are very entrenched in their own countries and territories and have huge support. So when we cover these groups, we cover them as a player in West Asia, simply that, okay? We're never going to caveat every mention of Hezbollah as a Western prescribed terrorist organization. It has no bearing on the story, and enlightens our audience not a whit. Our audience are mostly fairly sophisticated about this region because we cover West Asian geopolitics. So they know, they're coming to read about what's actually happening in the region without any whitewashing of either side. Now, Meta actually took down some of the posts they took down at the Cradle Instagram were quotes by Israeli officials on the capabilities of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. They just don't want anything, about these groups, even quotes by Israeli officials. So, it's impossible to cover our region from inside our region in English using the language of the other. We're not going to do that. We're journalists, okay? We are not going to use foreigners' language to describe us, our current situations, our history, and our futures and our aspirations. That will never, ever happen. They can deplatform us as much as they want. It's that old story about water leaking through a dike and person trying to stop it by plugging their fingers in, right? Water always finds a way out, okay? And you don't have enough fingers to plug this dike. So, it's a really important story because I think, for instance, I mean, there are parallels in the way the West, particularly the United States, has sought to sanction countries. I mean, the sanctions regime coming out of the Department of Treasury in Washington is so excessive, extends to so many countries, many who we wouldn't even identify as US adversaries. But US corporations are now increasingly having a say in this. When they see a competitor rising in the East or the global South, they oftentimes push the political arm of the government to impose sanctions so that they can retain their competitive edge, at least in Western territories. And the story of Huawei is one. Huawei surged ahead with 5G, and European countries and US allies were looking at this technology to incorporate it, and all of a sudden Huawei CTO, I think it was, got arrested in Canada, and whole host of things like this. So sanctions are nefarious. It's kind of like the last tool of imperialism, if you will. And what sanctions did is force, when you go at enough countries that have a significant population, a significant landmass, are largely middle class, so they're consumers, for instance, and they have natural resources. These are not inefficient states. These are not states without aspirations and capabilities. They are going to find alternative ways around these sanctions, as they are, by creating institutions and accelerating the progress of institutions like the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. You're increasingly getting sanctioned states or other states maybe under threat or very close to US scrutiny, looking at alternative ways to transact in trade and commerce, to transact just generally, looking at alternative currencies to the dollar and the euro. These are the fingers, so the American fingers in that dike, okay, of control of the global financial system is reaching a tipping point now. And we're seeing others challenge it. It's the same with the free flow of information. You just can't stop it. The internet has made it impossible to stop. And the more draconian their measures get, the more they undermine their own foundational principles, which they espouse, as in freedom and democracy and free speech. They really can't call out any country for censorship when they've arrested and detained the founding one of the founding partners of Telegram. They can't, they can't. What they did to Julian Assange, it was no way. And I personally think, okay, they're going to do this because they only know how to use the hammer approach to shut up an opposing view. It's not even dissent. I would say it's a majority view, certainly globally, and increasingly even in the United States and the UK, et cetera. Populations are up in arms about the Gaza war and the US's supply of arms to an obvious, a pariah state. So the more they do this, the more litigation we're going to see. And as a lawyer yourself, you understand that once lawsuits are brought, the underlying law usually supports the person bringing the lawsuit, at least on free speech. And of course, they might try to mitigate these wins by sort of, enacting different kind of legislation, but they're not going to win because legislation legislating against free speech is, like I said, a foundational principle of these nations. It's all we've ever heard. So they suddenly become the bad guys. And so I think we're going to see a lot of lawsuits. Certainly the Cradle has looked at and is in talk with digital rights attorneys to bring a suit, because what we did, and I urge people, if they're interested in the story, to read the Cradle story on Meta's permanent ban, because we do go into we do then pull up other major media outlets from West Asia, like Al Jazeera, and even Middle East Eye, which is based in London. Both of them are Qatari funded, much better funded media, much larger, and shown that, for instance, where they will show footage of the Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, actual footage, an actual picture. The Cradle has never done that. We would only do something like that if he was significantly blurred or in shadows. But they took down a Cradle Instagram post in which we showed Hassan Nasrallah's finger. So it's targeting the Cradle because we don't shy away from the kinds of things that other major West Asian media shies away from, because they're super concerned about advertising dollars. These are companies that are run on multi-million-dollar budgets, some as high as hundreds of millions of dollars in the region, and so they get away with it. They probably spend on advertising in a lot of the right places, and the Cradle doesn't do that. We're just pure journalism. We're looking now to scale entirely to be reader funded. We can do that because we operate in a small budget. They can't. So, in a court of law, we would say, well, why didn't you take down Al Jazeera and Middle East Eye? And why didn't you take down CNN's post with this Hamas quote? And why didn't you take down Bloomberg's quote post with the Hezbollah post? It's just in discovery, we'd be so interested to learn. We did learn through some connections at Meta that it was a human decision. It wasn't an algorithm. It wasn't an AI decision. It was a human decision to permanently ban the Cradle.
I'd like to sort of look at this question from an economic justice perspective, Sharmine. The August 19th article on the Cradle about the ban by Meta says that the Cradle was banned from social media platforms for allegedly violating community guidelines by, quote, praising terrorist organizations and engaging in incitement to violence. This prompted me to have a look at the distribution of users of Facebook, which is obviously a very important part of Meta. And I think these numbers are quite enlightening. The largest source of users for Facebook is India, which is almost 380 million users. And India does not designate Hamas as a terrorist organization, or Hezbollah, I believe. The second largest is the United States, which is about half of India's user population. It's 190 4 million. The third largest is Indonesia, which is almost 120 million. And Indonesia doesn't designate Hamas or Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. And then you look at the top 10, 11, and there are a number of countries in there that don't designate either of these groups as terrorist organizations, including Bangladesh with 56 million users, Pakistan with 47 million users. I'm pretty sure Egypt doesn't designate them as terrorist organizations, 46 million users. So if you look at the distribution of users of Facebook, most of them are in countries, based on statistics I've been able to glean, that do not designate either of these groups as terrorist organizations. And so what Facebook, an American-based company, is doing, even though it derives revenue from all of these users, because obviously the bigger your audience, the more your advertising revenue. So they make money off of people in countries that don't designate these groups as a terrorist organization, and yet they're imposing American standards of what is and is not a terrorist organization on the whole world, while they're making money from people in all of these countries. Doesn't that strike you as a grossly unjust economic arrangement? I mean, if they're going to actually generate huge billions of dollars of revenue from these countries, shouldn't they respect the standards that those countries themselves employ in determining whether or not someone is or is not a terrorist?
Of course, and that's to my point against again the Western narrative on all things, which sort of dominated the world, just doesn't have the same impact anymore, and that is scaring them. You know, they used to be able to hush a country into submission just by making loud declarations of looking into their human rights in Washington and that kind of thing. You know, and it's just no longer the case because there's an alternative now in the global scene. There's two poles or multi-poles. You know. And emerging faster. But it is almost entirely Washington's fault for coming so hard. The hammer strategy, you know, at anybody who stepped out of line, whether it was stepping out of line with the commercial trade agreement, whether it was how they processed US dollars in their countries, you know, which banks are allowed to do so, what they're allowed to spend it on, who they're allowed to trade with, you know, they've come from so many angles that it's at any rate, because of the geopolitical shifts in the world right now, this American aggression on free speech is not going to survive. Had it been done even 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it's a different story. But now so much is changing. They haven't changed their behaviors. They haven't come up with new, smarter tools that protect them while they keep doing the disturbing old acts of yesterday. Okay, so they're not efficient. Efficiency is a word I put great stock in, because actually the person who wins is always the more efficient of the parties. The US is sort of like lagging in decades old policy and thinking, and everyone else is racing ahead. So is the world. So are land routes and railway tracks and waterway routes. I mean, the Russians just yesterday, we reported at the Cradle on moved through the new Arctic route that has actually been able to exist because of climate change and the melting of ice caps. So there's a new Arctic route that people are calling the new Suez Canal, faster, cheaper route to transit between Europe and Russia and China and, you know, and the East. And but in this case, it was a tanker, a vessel, shipping vessel that was sanctioned, okay, by a sanctioned US sanctioned hub that was transporting Russian gas, LNG, somewhere. Okay, so now what are they going to do? Sanction everybody. It's fine, sanction everybody, but you know, the world's going to tick on. And without you and your tools of repression. So I think, you know, the Cradle was targeted because we're small media, right? But they look to set these precedents in the same way that they did some years ago with the Labour Party in the UK, with, you know, language that was deemed anti-Semitic, language critical of Israel, basically. But there wasn't huge pushback then. The situation was different. The geopolitical confrontation hadn't come to a head yet. And suddenly that kind of thinking became normalized. You can't criticize Israel. Now, of course, Gaza finished that, right? I mean, now people who have a lot of clout at Meta and others who have pushed for banning the word Zionism, which is Zionist's own description of themselves. I don't know why you would ban that, or river to the sea. Now these things are not holding water. Meta has said no. So it's important for countries like us, companies like us, media outlets like ours, which were the low-hanging fruit, to stop this in its tracks. We have to litigate. Like I said, we're journalists, we're not activists. We do have a point of view, but we'll put everything on the table and you can decide for yourself. And we don't hide it. That's the most important thing. If we have a point of view, we're not hiding it, So I think it's important for us to push ahead and stop this in its tracks. I don't know how the US thinks it can bring old practices to a new era, a new reality.
I completely agree with you, Sharmine. As a lawyer, we have to litigate. It is absolutely essential. Of course, some targets, you mentioned people, being prioritized because they're low-hanging fruit. In other words, they're perceived not to have the resources to litigate.
Correct.
But if you do have the resources, if you can scrounge them together, it's absolutely essential that we challenge these people in a court of law, because a lot of the crap they get away with only because people can't litigate. And they simply have to accept the edict from on high, in the suites of these social media companies and government offices. I want to ask you one other thing before we switch gears and talk a little bit about the geopolitical situation in West Asia. I'm curious to know your thoughts. I've been to Lebanon 5 times in the last, since the beginning of 2023. I'd never been there before. The first time I came, it was in the early part of last year. And of course, that was before the genocide began. And I was primarily interested in exploring the economic crisis in the country and also visiting Palestinian refugee camps. And then the genocide began, and I've been there 4 times since, starting in October. And I've spoken to many journalists in the country. And my overall sense from them is that they believe that they have a higher degree of free speech. They have more latitude to express themselves in quote unquote controversial opinions than we do in the West, which is quite, it's quite an eye-opening revelation for somebody like me who was born and raised in the West. And all I've heard all my life is, we are the bastion of free speech. What is your thought about this? Do you perceive, you obviously spent time in the West, do you perceive that Lebanon has, in the current environment, a higher degree of free expression than we have in the West?
100%. I find this, as a journalist, to be a delicious environment to be in. I think there are many reasons for it. Primarily, the fact that governance is very weak in Lebanon. They're still trying to decide on a president years after the election. Because there are also, as a journalist, it's a must. It's a place you must be if you're covering West Asia, because you genuinely can find every view in the region in this one city. Pro-Saudi, pro-US, pro-France, pro-Iran, pro-Turkey. You can find it all. I think there were other capitals in the past, like Cairo, where that used to be the case. It's not at all the case. Very repressive for journalists. You can't cross certain lines, and there are a lot of those. But in Lebanon, I think because of weak governance, everybody has people backing them up from their side, from their point of view. It's quite a melting pot of views and political interests. So, for instance, a writer for the Cradle, who's now become my partner in launching the Cradle Arabic. Okay, so we're fully now available in the Arabic language. No instant translate. It's there. He was sentenced by now this gentleman is Radwan Mortada, is probably the top security journalist in Lebanon. Okay, he's worked for and continues to work with Al Akhbar, with Al Jadid television, many outlets. He has worked with many Western outlets. He has produced documentaries for Bloomberg and Al Jazeera and you name it. And he has embedded with Al-Qaeda during the war in Syria and other extremist factions. And I mean, the guy is the whole package, is what you want as a journalist and what you want as a partner in your journalism. And a military court that has zero jurisdiction per the law in Lebanon sentenced him in absentia to 1 year and 1 month in prison. This was a few years back. And they couldn't. And of course, many people and lawyers and even other judges piled in and said the military has no jurisdiction. So Radwan disappeared for a few days, so nobody could arrest him while all this was being sorted out. And in fact, it has been sorted out. And the head of the Lebanese army, who I think, so I think Redwan's the litigation against and the military stance against him was because he had criticized certain actions of the head of the commander of the Lebanese army, and the commander of the Lebanese army just recently asked for a private meeting with him. So, you know, everything it's a small country too, a population of 5 million. So people sort out their conflicts locally. I mean, it just works. If you were a country of 80 million, forget it, you know.
Yeah.
Also, because it's a country of 5 million, everybody has connections in the general security institution, in the army, in the police forces, in the various political parties. Everybody. I'm talking about the guy who pumps gas to the guy who, you know, has a multi-million-dollar company, and you don't know whose connection is going to be stronger. So in a way, it's like a great equalizing thing. You know, you have poor governance, which means government can interfere in speech, and so it is a breathing space, genuinely, for journalists,
Right.
in a world that has become so hostile to information, and you know, much less so, I think, in the East and the South, though not exclusively. I mean, there's some places that are very repressive in terms of media, but you know, as we're seeing the West become even worse, you know, every day, sanction journalists, arrest journalists. Now they arrest you at Heathrow Airport. I have sought legal advice on this, so I know what to do if they try to stop me there, and they really can't do very much, to be honest. You know, just it's an intimidation practice, and I believe once litigation starts with somebody who's well funded on this, you know, we'll see some reversals, and we'll see a loosening of that thing, because I mean, they've actually upped it now. They've actually arrested people instead of just questioning them. But really, they do that to intimidate and to steal the data on your devices.
Mhm.
Okay. I'm sorry, as a journalist, my sources must be protected.
Right. And I'm sure they're also trying to discredit these people. The mere fact of you having been arrested will cause some people to question your legitimacy as a journalist, I imagine. So,
I think that's the case, especially if you're trying to make it in the mainstream. But here's the thing: when the Cradle had the permanent ban from Meta, the number of people who started watching us for the first time on our podcasts and reading our, you know, our articles on our websites and donating to our Patreon and directly through credit card on the Cradle went up dramatically. So
right,
it's just not the same climate for these guys. Like I said, they're using excessive policy, but their excessive policies and actions are actually in a world today of geopolitical choice, just a world today of choice,
right.
are having, you know, the wrong effect for them.
Yeah,
They're not going to reach. Yeah.
I've often argued that censorship is self-defeating in part because it draws attention to the person who's been censored. So
It
people
really
start
does.
asking you, well, why would they censor that person? That person must be saying something unusual and interesting. In any event, I'd like to close out, Sharmine, with a question of substance rather than, you know, we've had a very lively, interesting discussion about free speech, but I want to talk about what's happening on the ground in West Asia. I have been of the view, and I still ascribe to this view, that Iran somehow, some way, will retaliate eventually for the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran on July 31st. However, although I don't have a crystal ball, I was expecting that it would have happened by now, but it hasn't. Hezbollah has retaliated, and it was very clear that it was launching what it regarded a retaliatory strike for the assassination of Fouad Shukr on July 31st. But Iran hasn't. And in this context, you recently gave a presentation, which I was able to watch it in substantial part, about boiling the Israeli frog. And it's in that context I wanted to ask you about this. Why do you think, to the extent you can, discern an answer, and who knows, we don't have a hotline to, the office of the Iranian president or the Ayatollah, but why do you think, based on everything you've seen and heard in the region, that Iran has not yet retaliated? And do you think it will eventually retaliate?
I think before even answering the question, viewers should understand that this decades long practice that has been normalized by the Western unipolar world of a swift, hard slap at an adversary, okay? A big PR campaign to launch a war, and then shock and awe type of thing where and media spin to mitigate any embarrassments, etc., is just a Western practice. It's not how other civilizations go about things. Okay. Nothing wrong with the people obviously from other civilizations and cultures do things differently. All right, the way they sit at the table with their families, the way they maybe treat their elders. There's many distinctions, generalizations, obviously, but Iran is notable for, first of all, it's been around for thousands of years, right? And even though being invaded, it's come out of that and continued as a country. Oftentimes that doesn't happen. Once you've been invaded, countries break up and they become other things. But Iran has maintained its country for thousands of years. And it is a very strategic thinker. Some credit chess from having been invented in Iran, but certainly in Asia. And, people talk about Iranian as carpet weavers, very patient, okay, until they create a masterpiece. So that is kind of civilizationally the way Iranians approach things. They also, believe it or not, care a lot about the loss of life. This is not something we're accustomed to by the West. So we're thinking, oh, Iran's scared. Iran's never going to do this. But actually, Iran considers minimizing loss of life. That is something that is 100% a trait of West Asia's axis of resistance. All of them think this way. Okay, human life is not disposable. It's just the way this axis thinks, not others in the region, but this axis in particular. It is not the way the Americans think. So in my presentation, Boiling the Israeli Frog, it was about a parable, the old parable. If you put a frog in boiling water and you raise the temperature only 1 degree at the time, the frog won't know it's being boiled until it's dead, right? Mm-hmm. So the resistance axis is, Israel is obviously qualitatively a military power, and the biggest one in this region, has nuclear weapons, etc. So those are its advantages. It has a lot of vulnerabilities. It's a small state, small population, and so reliant on its image around the world, right? As well as Jews feeling secure there so that they move there. These are the two foundations of Israel even existing today. The myths and fairy tales that keep it looking like a victim perpetually, and the artificial sense of security that Israeli leaders have propagated so that Jews feel free, safe there, and it's safe moving there. So to reverse that, to reverse the entire Zionist project, you have to do what? You have to make the victim suddenly, drop its veil and become a pariah. And you have to create such a sense of insecurity among the population who you don't want to kill. Okay, again, this is the axis's way of thinking. You don't want to kill them. You want the insecurity to make them leave and not move over there. And so this is essentially why Iran takes its time. It is just foundationally a slow strategic thinker, thinks of all alternatives and makes plan A, B, C, all the way to Z. It's not like a one or two or three shot, it doesn't think that way. And it wants the enemy not to anticipate what it's going to do. So the next operation will not resemble the first operation. Okay. Always keep the enemy off guard. You look at the way the resistance axis practice its implementation of warfare. It is irregular warfare. You can find a lot of Sun Tzu in the way they practice, because these are age-old philosophies that always make sense. Why take heavy losses, and why, kill a lot of people, and why have a major hot war when you can slowly degrade the enemy psychologically, institutionally, politically, diplomatically, financially, in all these ways. And that is the essence of irregular warfare. I do believe Iran's going to react and retaliate for that killing, because it said it would. Okay. If you notice, Israel no longer does the kind of operations it did earlier this year when it bombed the Iranian consulate in Damascus, killing a dozen or so. Because Iran's retaliation was fairly swift and very hard, but again, not killing civilians and sending strong messages. And importantly, something that they didn't even care, like if the Israelis saw it as successful or not. They gathered so much intelligence from where Israel's air defenses and its allies' air defenses would be in the region that they win, So its next reprisal will be different. They now have the intelligence. What are they going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again? So the Israelis were too afraid to take on, Iran as a target directly. So they did the next weaselly best thing, was to take out the head of the Palestinian resistance in Tehran, which Iran still views as a violation of their sovereignty. And the Americans went, through all their friends and allies, tell the Iranians, but they didn't target an Iranian official. Nobody. You still hit our sovereignty. International law reigns in Iran. They will use it to the extent, and they will retaliate. The when and how, nobody, of course, knows, and nobody should know.
Right.
I do like their surprises, I have to say. Nothing's ever so simple. You'll have to spend weeks analyzing why it was successful for them and why the enemy suffered.
And I'm reminded by the statement of the Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah after the killing of Fuad Shukr and before the retaliation. He said, "Waiting is part of the punishment." So
100%, 100%.
he got a standing ovation from his crowd when he said that. It was quite interesting.
But the impact of psychological warfare, which has always been practiced against us, divide and rule, make us feel insecurity all the time, has succeeded in beating down the psychology of a lot of the Arab world, and caused the defeatist narrative to spread widely and be normalized here. But no, I mean, I think it's time for reversal. Psychological warfare is almost the easiest and cheapest tactic. And, the Pentagon always talks about full spectrum warfare, full spectrum, right? Military, economic, sanctions, cyber. We're doing the same. And guess what? It's great. It's cheap for us. You have all your air defenses on all the time, okay? And you're shooting down birds. The Israelis have been caught shooting down birds with $50,000 Iron Dome missiles, okay? We're killing them, it's that simple.
The cost of maintaining aircraft carrier battle groups in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Yeah.
But in any event, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you today, Sharmine, and I hope we can have more conversations like this in the future. Thank you so much for having me on, Dimitri. And you have to, next time you're in Beirut, we have to go for a nice cup of Arabic coffee. I look forward to it.